This is perhaps the shortest introduction in history. The beginning of our inquiry proceeds from the thing which must be overcome. This paradox occurs. The self is that which gets in the way of the development of the self. The first thing to say is that every reading of Nietzsche is an interpretation of Nietzsche. Hence Nietzsche's famous phrase, "There are no facts, only interpretations." How to sustain the objective thing in the case of Zarathustra is a mystery. The best we can do is refer to general axioms. It ought to be obvious that Nietzsche was not a Christian. Hence, an interpretation of Zarathustra, which aligns the master with theism, is principally false. However, this is not to say that a positive principle in favor of theism cannot be drawn from Zarathustra, pending the reader's creativity. "And life itself told me this secret," says Zarathustra. "Behold," it said, "I am that which must overcome itself again and again." What is this overcoming, this surpassing? Or better yet, what can we make of this overcoming? I submit to you, it is up to the reader to make something of the text, because no one will do it for him. And the text is not something which can or will interpret itself. Life speaking to Zarathustra says that I have to be struggle and becoming and goal and conflict of goals. Ah, he who divines my will surely divines too, along what crooked paths it has to go. Whatever I create, and however much I love it, soon I have to oppose it and my love. Thus will my will have it. Thus life once taught me, says Zarathustra, and with this teaching do I solve the riddle of your hearts, you wisest men. Truly I say to you, unchanging good and evil does not exist. From out of themselves they must overcome themselves again and again. You exert power with your values and doctrines of good and evil, you assessors of values, and this is your hidden love and glittering, trembling, and overflowing of your souls. But a mightier power and a new overcoming grow from out of your values. Egg and eggshell break against them. And he who has to be a creator in good and evil truly has first to be a destroyer and break values. Thus, the greatest evil belongs with the greatest good. This, however, is the creative good. Let us speak of this, you wisest men, even if it is a bad thing. To be silent is worse. All suppressed truths become poisonous, and let everything that can break upon our truths break. There is many a house still to build. Unchanging good and evil do not exist. But is this declaration true? How could we sustain the idea of unchanging good and evil? I submit to you that Zarathustra is aware of the logical difficulty involved in this task. As if the philosopher might say, the only thing needed here is the declaration, because the premise which tries to refute it will ultimately end up refuting itself. Who would dare to prove the syllogism, X is good, X is unchanging? I submit to you that many of the strongest arguments in philosophy work this way. This reminds us of what Nietzsche said in Beyond Good and Evil. It has gradually become clear to me what every great philosophy has hitherto been: a confession on the part of its author and a kind of involuntary and unconscious memoir. To explain how a philosopher's most remote metaphysical assertions have actually been arrived at, it is always well and wise to ask oneself first, what morality does he aim at? In proving X, does one really prove the nature of good and evil? Does one really demonstrate that X is unchanging? Or does one merely manifest their moral desire, a kind of psychological preference? Not unlike Heraclitus, Zarathustra speaks of flux. Life is indeed a struggle of becoming, but not one of arriving. Perhaps the most important emphasis is this idea of learning to hate what we love, of opposing the beauty we create. Of course, it should be known that Nietzsche is here speaking in the theoretical sense, in the realm of ideas. Whatever I create, and however much I love it, says Nietzsche, soon I have to oppose it. But is this not the very opposite of life? Is this ethic not backwards? Should we not love and cherish our greatest creations? Or perhaps the observation of life proves that life itself is backwards. That is to say, that it exists against our ideals. Or that the force of function functions against our metaphysics. If this is true, if this is the conclusion from the observation of life, then the man who knows this has an advantage in the context of life. Many useless and unnecessary principles, formalities, and blank ideals can simply be cast aside to make room for the truer principles of consequence. Speaking of good and evil, Nietzsche says, from out of themselves, they must overcome themselves again and again. In plain terms, we take this to mean that which is good eventually becomes evil, and that which is evil eventually becomes good. Hence the nature of becoming as the nature of change. There is a total absence of solidification. Perhaps we declare that only flux can be constant, in which case there is a constant shifting of good and evil. You exert power with your values and doctrines of good and evil, says Nietzsche, you assessors of values, and this is your hidden love and glittering, trembling and overflowing of your souls. A man is edified in this sense. It is doctrine which condemns the antithesis. It is doctrine which affirms the antithesis. Values are not, in and of themselves, absolute. They are contingent. We use our values to assess values. But it is only on the basis of presumption that we raise our values higher than the values we judge. A question mark is required here because there is such a thing as a higher value. But it is not higher in the sense of metaphysics. Hence, to again quote Nietzsche, but a mightier power and a new overcoming grow from out of your values. Egg and egg shell break against them. And he who has to be a creator in good and evil truly has first to be a destroyer and break values. The question is whether or not we have the strength to destroy what we love. The question is whether or not we can overcome our old values with new values as the way of overcoming self. But this task is far from us. We lack the power to destroy what we love. We lack the power to break values which have been kind to us, which have delivered us, which we believe have protected us. Beyond the shallows lies the deep, and the deep is full of terror, and the deep is dark and cold. But how can we be great if we do not learn to swim in the deep? In order to be a creator, in the sense which Nietzsche speaks of creation, we must be willing to create against the very thing we love. We must be willing to forsake the ideological child for a new and better formation. Hence, good and evil are something which must be continually overcome. Thus, says Nietzsche, the greatest evil belongs with the greatest good. This, however, is the creative good. Let us speak of this, you wisest men, even if it is a bad thing. To be silent is worse. All suppressed truths become poisonous, and let everything that can break upon our truths break. There is many a house still to build. The creative good is that which is not afraid to create against the greatest good. In what sense do men call this a bad thing? In the sense that we celebrate the tradition of an established good as though it were an absolute good. In the sense that we believe in an unchanging good. In the sense that evil must always be the same evil. In the sense that this created thing is called evil when the Creator calls it good. "O my brothers," says Nietzsche, "with whom does the greatest danger for the whole human future lie? Is it not with the good and the just? With those who say and feel in their hearts, 'We already know what is good and just. We possess it too. Woe to those who are still searching for it.' A true creator must be willing to challenge the nature of good and evil. But here is the vital point. He must be willing to challenge these principles of good and evil in himself above all social institutions. His true battle lies with himself. For we are the affirmers of good and evil. I love the brave," says Nietzsche, "but it is not enough to be a swordsman. One must also know against whom to be a swordsman. We, my friends, are the dogmatizers. We are the ones who hold these principles against ourselves without decay. But how can this be wise if there is no constant to the nature of good and evil? We have cheated ourselves with this thing. Nietzsche tells us that to be silent is worse. In this, he is anticipating the objection of those who inflict fear, of those who warn us about the uncharted terrors of the deep. And unto them, Nietzsche says, all suppressed truths become poisonous. Let everything that can break upon our truths, plural, break. There is many a house still to build. It is worse to refrain from this analysis than it is to engage in this analysis, precisely because we become the victims of a suffocating dogmatism. We are no longer creators. We have abandoned the essence of flux which characterizes the nature of being. Hence, we are set against life, trying to fight the natural flow of life. Things must change. Like Heraclitus, Zarathustra speaks of flux. But men want us to fear the way of the Creator. We are told it leads to violence and suffering. We are told it can never result in a greater good. We are told that the mere act of challenging the consensus, of breaking up old traditions, is evil in itself. But how can these declarations be sustained if there is no such thing as unchanging good and evil? Nietzsche tells us that it is far worse to rot in a stale dogmatism. He says this ideology will become poisonous precisely because he takes the ground of being to be that of flux. And if this presumption is in fact true, as it would seem by every empirical account, then he is right that unchanging principles will become poisonous. These principles will eventually start to work against life, no matter how much they once affirmed life. If man will not be smitten by the declarations he makes to himself, then he must learn to challenge the relevance of his declarations. He must learn to kill the thing he loves for the sake of life. For we have many houses to build. Why would we build one house when we have many houses to build? And how many of us believe the object of life consists in building one solitary house? We never knew life was the building of many houses. And he who sets his mind on one has set himself toward a future of decay. For what happens when his house burns? Here the man finds himself alone in the street, impoverished, with nowhere to lay his head. He believes the object of life has been destroyed, when in fact, he must be a builder of many houses. At times he will live in the south, at other times he will migrate to the north. But what is true is that there must be many houses. The man who is engaged with life on the level of life knows he must build and destroy many things. Build and destroy many values. To transcribe this poetry into the language of self, self is that which must overcome itself again and again. How many people impart this wisdom to the child? Is this wisdom so simple that it never needs to be said? Or is this wisdom so simple that it must be said? Surely there are those of us who believe we can arrive, believe in solidification, work eternally toward the hope of a constant. And at times we are afflicted by the error of this thought, which becomes a standard that is hostile to life. We subconsciously impose this standard upon ourselves, and as such, insofar as this standard is impossible, we proceed to suffer. It would be an error to say this standard never occurs. It would be an error to say that all common knowledge is performed by nature and known by nature. How often are we simply destroyed by the confines of a narrow perspective? Man needs open space. What happens when we become conscious of the act of overcoming? What happens when we articulate this standard to ourselves? Not that we must arrive, but that we must overcome again and again. Are we oppressed by this knowledge, or rather liberated? Does it not help to put the struggle of life in perspective, to give suffering context? Now listen to Nietzsche drive this point home with the greatest force. And be on your guard, too, against the assaults your love makes upon you. The solitary extends his hand too quickly to anyone he meets. To many men, you ought not to give your hand, but only your paw. And I should like it if your paw had claws, too. But you yourself will always be the worst enemy you can encounter. You yourself lie in wait for yourself in caves and forests. Solitary man, you are going the way to yourself, and your way leads past yourself and your 7 devils. You will be a heretic to yourself, and a witch, and a prophet, and an evildoer, and a villain. You must be ready to burn yourself in your own flame. How could you become new if you had not first become ashes? What lies in wait for the man who enters solitude? The omniscient, infallible self. The man who enters solitude is in danger of believing all that he hears, which is to say, all that he tells himself by way of declaration. It is what one takes into solitude, says Nietzsche, that grows there, the beast within included, and so many should be dissuaded from solitude. We always lie in wait for ourselves, and even now the enemy lurks in the shadow of what we are. One who understands this can only see this as the greatest threat. Unless such a man cares nothing for his power over life as a power over his negative self, which is truly a power over his greatest enemy. To thwart all impediments to progress because one cares for progress. What does Nietzsche mean when he says, you will be a heretic to yourself, and a witch, and a prophet, and an evildoer, and a villain? You must be ready to burn yourself in your own flame. How could you become new if you had not first become ashes? This is not something imposed from without. This is not a danger conducive to society. Instead, this is a danger that comes from within. You are your own worst enemy. Have you ever seen yourself as a heretic, as a witch, as a prophet, as an evildoer? If you have never been a villain to yourself, then you have never grown past yourself. I submit to you that the man or woman who would overcome self must see the villainy of self. But to speak thus is not to speak in terms of piety. It is to speak in terms of self-creation from the raw basis of physical reality. It is not to speak in terms of metaphysical absolutes, but to speak in terms of physiological flux, which is the very ground in essence of being. Our morality is a morality of becoming, of evolving. To partake of the alternative is to cease to grow. And when you see the heretic, you must burn him to ashes in order to become something new. And when the new becomes the old, you must once again burn the image in order to become something new. From the ashes of death rise the blossoms of life. The question is whether or not we can see ourselves as villains. The question is whether or not we have the strength to burn the thing we love, to substitute new truth in place of old truth. To never despise a former state is to be held in bondage by that state. We must learn to criticize the thing we are if we would overcome the self we have. And in this, we might say, not just our ideas, but our entire way of life, the very method of learning itself. I submit to you that a man's intelligence will be limited insofar as his self gets in the way, are liberated insofar as he is able to overcome the enemy of himself. The former is held back by himself, while the latter is increased by overcoming himself. Perhaps the most important thing to explain is that the egocentric self is not some distant, abstract problem, but is a problem we all face right now at this very moment. What declaratory statements are you making to yourself? How many of these go unnoticed and unchallenged? This is not a problem for someone else to solve, not something in the distant future, not something which exists when it can be perceived. And of course, if it really existed, it would always be perceived. No, my friends, this is a problem for us to solve now. Do not worry about another man's statements to himself. Worry about your own. For only by doing thus is it possible to overcome the enemy that lies within, which is the enemy of the self, the heretic, witch, and prophet. For how is it that this paradox occurs? The self is that which gets in the way of the development of the self. One might ask, how do we account for the fact that we have declared our lecture to be subjective? How do we account for the fact that the present is only an interpretation of Nietzsche? The answer here is rather simple. What is the value of the interpretation we have given? Does the individual find our creative narrative helpful? This allows us to move beyond the dialectic of identity, which is to say, the marking out and defining and defending of absolutes. Instead of asking the question as to whether or not we have properly interpreted Nietzsche, we simply contrast the value of our interpretation with the value of another interpretation. If we can create a productive interpretation from the material, something existentially useful, then I would argue that such an interpretation, no matter how subjective, is warranted insofar as it is valuable, which is to say, relevant to the life of the individual. Who has not succumbed to his own victory, says Nietzsche? Whose eye has not dimmed in this intoxicated twilight? Whose foot has not stumbled and in victory forgotten how to stand? Let us stand, therefore, against the enemy of self by being aware of the tactics of the self. He that is content in himself is possibly a victim of self. But we have only been speaking of self as the enemy. We must leave it for another time to speak of self as the friend.